Everyone in the courtroom stared like he didn't belong there, not because he was dangerous, not because he was guilty, but because he was poor, because his jacket didn't fit right, his shoes were worn down at the edges, and his eyes held. The kind of tired that didn't come from staying up late, it came from staying strong for too long. Tyler stood alone at the defendant's table, his hands shaking just enough to betray what he was trying to hide. The judge didn't even pretend to take him seriously. "You think this is a playground?" he'd said with a smirk, his words landing like stones in Tyler's chest. "You don't just walk into my courtroom and pretend to be a lawyer." But Tyler hadn't been pretending. He had read every case, memorized every law, dug through every file with the desperation of a boy trying to save the last thing in the world that belonged to him. He wasn't here to act smart. He was here to survive. No one cared. The judge laughed. The bailiff laughed. Even the court clerk chuckled into her sleeve, and in that moment, something inside Tyler broke, not like glass shattering, but like a door slamming shut. He realized he could study every law in the book, dress like a lawyer, speak like one, but to them, he'd always just be a broke kid from nowhere. Still, he didn't look down. He didn't cry. He only blinked once, slowly, and held his breath like he was holding back an ocean. They didn't know it yet, but the boy they just humiliated wasn't walking away defeated. He was about to become the storm they never saw coming. Walked the cracked sidewalk like it was glass beneath his feet, careful, cautious, and completely unseen. The courthouse was 3 blocks behind him, but the sting of that room clung to his skin like smoke. Every step felt like he was walking deeper into a world that didn't want him. He reached the bus stop, dropped onto the bench, and stared at his reflection in the advertisement glass, a face too young to carry so much disappointment, eyes that had stopped asking for anything. His tie had twisted around during the hearing. He didn't fix it. What was the point? People passed by.
Number.
One looked twice. He'd gotten used to that, being invisible. At the group home they called him the quiet one, which was their polite way of saying the one we forget exists. At school, teachers ignored his raised hand, and at jobs, the few he'd found, managers only learned his name when they were yelling it, but nothing ever hurt quite like that courtroom, because there he wasn't invisible. It was a target. He reached into his folder and pulled out the faded photo of his mother. She wore a soft blue scarf and had tired eyes like his, but her smile was full of something fierce, something warm. She had worked nights at a gas station, cooked for the whole house before heading out, and always came back humming as if exhaustion never touched her. When she died, no one brought flowers. No one even claimed her locket. So Tyler did. That's what started this whole mess. He hadn't stolen anything. That abandoned house still had her things in it, things that mattered to no one but him. But when he'd broken in to retrieve them, someone called the police. No. They didn't ask why he was there, just cuffed him and wrote it up as trespassing and attempted theft. Now he was a repeat juvenile offender, and now he was a joke. The bus wheezed up to the curb and Tyler stepped on, nodding to the driver who didn't return the gesture. He slid into the back row, clutching the folder like it held his life, because in some ways it did. The group home he returned to wasn't violent or cruel, just indifferent. It was somehow worse. The staff barely looked up as he entered. One nodded toward the fridge. "Dinner's cold. Heat it yourself." He didn't answer, just went upstairs. The hallway was narrow, the floor creaked, and the air smelled faintly of bleach and microwave soup. His room was small, a bed, a desk, and a dresser missing one drawer. He locked the door behind him even though he knew locks didn't matter here. People took what they wanted. He opened his laptop, a busted, donated model that overheated in minutes, and resumed reading legal case files. Not because it would change anything, but because it was the only thing that made sense, the only thing he could control. By midnight, his eyes were bloodshot, his stomach empty. But the pain in his chest wasn't hunger, it was loneliness. He hadn't had a real conversation in weeks. No one asked how he was. No one sat beside him just to sit. Even silence felt different when it was shared. Tyler didn't have even that. Just 4 walls, a blinking screen, a clock that never moved fast enough. The next morning, he went to his part-time job at Ray's Auto and Tire, a place that paid just enough to cover bus fare and weekend meals, but not enough to matter. Ray, the owner, didn't talk much. When he did, it was usually to complain. "Late again," he muttered as Tyler walked in. even though he wasn't. Tyler didn't argue. He grabbed a rag, wiped his hands, and went to work replacing a rusted brake pad. By noon, the sun was scorching. Tyler's shirt clung to his back, and grease marked every inch of his skin. Another employee, Jeff, a guy in his late 20s with more muscles than patience, shoved past him hard enough to knock over a can of oil. "Watch it." "Genius," Jeff snapped, already laughing. Tyler bent to clean the spill. Jeff's voice followed. "Heard you tried to be your own lawyer. What's next?" "Brain surgery." The other workers chuckled. Ray didn't say a word. Later, when Tyler asked if he could leave an hour early to pick up his court papers, Ray waved him off without looking. "Clock out, don't come back tomorrow." Explanation, no warning, just gone. Tyler didn't flinch. He only nodded, washed the grease from his hands, and walked out the same way he'd walked in, alone. He sat on the curb behind the shop for a long time, watching ants move across the cracked pavement. It was a strange comfort, their silent determination. No applause, no help, just movement. He wondered if that was what his life would always be. Constant effort, no recognition. But then, just before he stood to leave, a voice called from across the alley. "Hey." Tyler turned. An old man, probably in his 70s, leaned from a back door. He wore a faded cap and had a stoop in his spine that made him look permanently tired. But his eyes were sharp. "You work over there?" Tyler nodded. The man squinted. "They always treat you like that?" Hesitated, then nodded again. The man shook his head slowly. "Figures." He disappeared inside, then returned with something wrapped in foil. "You eaten?" Tyler blinked, shook his head no. The man tossed the bundle toward him. Tyler caught it, surprised by its warmth. "Meatloaf sandwich," the man said, "for my lunch." "Don't argue." Tyler stared at the foil, heart-heavy hands still trembling slightly. "Thanks," he said, voice almost a whisper. The man shrugged. "Don't thank me. Just keep your chin up, son. You look like someone who's going to surprise a lot of people." Then he was gone. It wasn't a grand gesture, not a rescue, just a small act of kindness, in a world that had shown him nothing but doors closing. But for Tyler, it meant everything, because for the first time in a long while, someone had seen him. The sandwich sat half-eaten beside him as Tyler stared at the wall in his small room. Hours had passed since the old man's kindness, and yet the moment played on loop in his mind like a forgotten song. Suddenly remembered. It said it so casually, "You look like someone who's going to surprise a lot of people." Tyler had heard 100 insults that week, but it was that one simple sentence he couldn't forget. He wanted to believe it, but wanting and believing weren't the same thing. His laptop sat open, humming faintly. The screen displayed an article he'd read at least a dozen times: How to File a Motion Without a Licensed Attorney. He'd memorized the forms, the process, even the county codes. But reading wasn't the same as doing. Knowledge had never been his problem. Being allowed to use it, that was the wall. He ran his fingers over his folder again. Inside were copies of his juvenile record, photos of his mom, case notes, and the transcript from his last hearing. He read them again like, they might change this time. They never did. Tyler leaned back in his chair. The fan above spun lazily, clicking with every rotation. He closed his eyes and let the sound blur his thoughts, and that's when he heard it again, not the fan, but her voice, not in the room, but in his memory. "You don't have to be loud to be powerful," she used to say. "You just have to be right and brave enough to stand on it." She used to whisper it when he came home crying from school, backpack torn, homework ruined. She'd kneel in front of him, wipe his face with her sleeve, and press her forehead to his. "Right and brave, Tyler. That's what you be. What you be." It was the only thing in his life that had ever felt like armor. He opened his eyes slowly, and without fully realizing why, clicked open a new tab and searched Community Legal Resource Center Volunteer Program. The site loaded slowly. A nonprofit organization downtown offering legal aid and guidance to those who couldn't afford representation. One section mentioned a youth internship, unpaid, mostly clerical work. But at the bottom in small print, a line stood out. "We welcome applicants who believe in justice regardless of background." He stared at it for a long time. It couldn't be real, or if it was, it couldn't be meant for someone like him. And yet, his fingers moved. He typed up a short email, just his name, age, and a sentence that simply read, "I've studied legal procedures on my own and want to help people like me." Then he hovered over the send button. He didn't click it. Instead, he stood and paced the room. What if it was a joke? What if they looked him up and saw his record and laughed? Worse, what if they responded? And it turned out he wasn't good enough after all. His mother used to tell him that fear wasn't always a sign to stop. Sometimes it meant you were about to do something that mattered. He pressed send, then he shut the laptop like it might bite him and walked away. The next day passed slowly. The job at Ray's was gone. The court date for his next hearing still weeks away. The group home was its usual blur of noise and disinterest. But in the quiet between dinner and sleep, he checked his inbox. There was a reply. Subject, Ari. Internship inquiry body. Hi Tyler, thank you for reaching out. Right. We'd love to meet you and hear more about your interest. Can you come in Thursday at 10 a.m.? Marcia Delaney, program coordinator. He stared at the message. Not breathing, he read it again. 10 minutes passed before he moved. Thursday came fast. Too fast. He didn't sleep the night before. Instead, he tried on every piece of clothing he owned, none of it feeling right. In the end, he wore the same slightly too big blazer from the courtroom. He brushed his hair back, cleaned his shoes with a wet cloth, and held his folder to his chest like a lifeline. The office was in an old brick building downtown, tucked between a laundromat and a sandwich shop. He stood outside for nearly 20 minutes, staring at the door, afraid it might disappear the moment he touched it. When he finally stepped in, the first thing he noticed was the quiet, not the cold kind like in court, but warm, working silence papers. Shuffling phones ringing gently, voices murmuring in focus, kind of quiet that felt like purpose. A woman in her 40s looked up from behind the desk and smiled. You must be Tyler. He nodded, hands stiff at his sides. She stood, extended her hand. I'm Marcia. We're glad you're here. No hesitation. No pause to assess his clothes, his posture, his silence. Just welcome. He sat with her for 20 minutes. She asked what he'd read. He named every legal reference he could remember. She asked if he was comfortable organizing client files. He said yes. She asked why he wanted to help. He hesitated, then told her the truth. Because no one ever fought for my mom. And I don't want to live in a world where people like her keep losing. She nodded slowly, eyes soft. That's a better answer than most law students give. Started the following Monday. The first few days were simple, scanning, filing, copying. But each task felt like a thread pulling him toward something bigger. He listened closely when the paralegals discussed cases. He stayed late, reading case notes they threw away. He memorized them like stories, and slowly, something shifted. A paralegal named Jonah, a man in his 30s with a sharp wit and tired eyes, noticed him staying late one evening. You really like this stuff, huh? Tyler shrugged. It's the only thing that makes sense. Jonah smirked. Do you ever thought about law school? The question hit like thunder he had, but he'd never dared say it aloud. Tyler looked away. People like me don't get that far. No. Jonah didn't laugh. Didn't mock, he just said, maybe it's time they did. Wasn't a promise. Wasn't even encouragement. It's just a simple statement of possibility, and somehow that was louder than any praise he'd ever been given. Tyler walked home that night with something in his chest he hadn't felt in years. Not confidence, not even hope, just permission. The smallest beginning of belief. Tyler arrived at the office earlier than usual. A coffee in one hand and a plastic bag with extra highlighters in the other. It wasn't much, but it was his way of feeling like part of the team, showing up prepared, useful, present. He greeted Marcia with a soft nod, said morning to Jonah, then headed to the filing room. The rhythm of his days had begun to form a kind of fragile safety. That morning, Jonah dropped a file on his desk. Not just a file, a case. Pull every record you can on this, Jonah said, tapping the folder. Witness statements, court, dates, any history. The client's a minor assault charge, but he says he was defending his sister. We're arguing for dismissal. Tyler froze. A real case. Not a copy job or a label-making task, but research. He opened the file slowly, reading through the brief summary. A boy named Elijah, 16 black, had broken a man's jaw outside a liquor store. Tyler read the next line and felt the room tilt. The man had a record of stalking children. He knew this story, not this case, but the feeling behind it. The moment someone tried to touch someone you loved, and the world punished you for protecting them. He worked on it late into the evening, and eyes burning, head heavy, printing every record he could find. He made notes, cross-referenced laws from similar cases, even marked weak spots in the prosecutor's argument. He placed the folder on Jonah's desk at 9 p.m., walked home under a sky full of anxious stars, and slept with something that almost felt like peace. The next morning, Jonah looked up from the file and whistled. "You wrote all this?" Tyler nodded. This is solid," Jonah said. "Where'd you learn to do this?" Tyler's voice was barely more than a whisper. "I just read everything." Jonah smiled, shook his head in disbelief, and said something that would stay carved into Tyler's chest for the next week. "Kid, you're better than half the interns we pay." That sentence played in his mind like a secret song. He started staying later, reading longer. Jonah let him sit in on strategy meetings, sometimes even asked for his opinion. Once Marcia introduced him to a visiting law professor as one of our brightest volunteers. Tyler's heart swelled at the words. He was beginning to breathe differently. But the world, it doesn't forget people like Tyler. It waits. A week later, on a gray Thursday afternoon, Marcia called him into her office. Her face was tight, drawn in, a way he hadn't seen before. Tyler sat down slowly. "I need to ask you something," she said gently. "Did you access a sealed juvenile record last night?" Tyler blinked. "Yes. It was for the client, his prior detentions. I thought you didn't have permission," she said softly. "Only staff can open sealed files." His throat went dry. "But I used the same login Jonah gave me," he told me. Marcia looked away. "He shouldn't have." "But you're not an employee, Tyler. You're not licensed, and technically, what you did violates our protocol. It could be seen as unauthorized practice of law." He didn't speak. The silence dragged. "We're going to have to suspend your access for now," she said quietly, "until we talk to the board." His stomach twisted. "Am I fired?" Her eyes softened with guilt. "You're not an employee, remember?" Nodded once, slowly. Landed heavier than a firing ever could. By the time he walked outside, the sky had turned pale and mean. It had started to drizzle, not enough to soak him, just enough to make the air feel cold against his skin. His blazer clung to him like a second punishment. He walked for hours, no destination. No plan, just the sound of his shoes hitting pavement and the thought, repeating in his head like thunder. I did everything right. He had followed the rules, listened, stayed late, read everything. He hadn't broken in. I hadn't stolen. He had truly tried to help, and still he'd been reminded of who he really was in their eyes. Not a student. Not a volunteer. Not even a person who made a mistake. Just a kid with a record, who got too close to something he didn't belong to. He ended up at the edge of the city near the bus terminal. Sat down on a bench soaked with rain and pulled his hood over his face. He hadn't cried in months, not even when his mom died. Not when the judge laughed in court. Not when he'd been mocked, insulted, or ignored, but now he did. He cried with the kind of hollow ache that no longer asked for relief. The kind that just wanted to disappear. The pain didn't feel like a wound. It felt like confirmation. They were right. He wasn't meant for this world, not for law, not for change. Just a clever orphan boy pretending he could matter. At some point, someone offered him a coffee. He didn't look up, didn't respond. The cup sat on the bench until it went cold. He returned to the group home past midnight. No one noticed. No one cared. He lay on the stiff mattress, face turned to the wall, and let the silence eat him. That night, he didn't open his laptop. He didn't check emails. He didn't reread case law. He just stared at the wall and thought, maybe they were all right. Maybe the world didn't need people like him. Maybe justice was a game only the privileged got to play, and maybe he was foolish for ever believing otherwise. Tyler didn't leave his room the next morning, or the morning after that. His inbox gathered unread emails. His textbooks sat untouched. The suit jacket he had once worn so proudly hung crooked on the wall, the sleeves now limp like arms that had given up. But something strange happened on the third day. He heard a knock. It wasn't loud or impatient. Just one soft tap, and then silence. He ignored it. Another knock came the next morning, then again, always gentle. Always silent after. On the fourth day he opened the door. It was Malik, the youngest boy at the group home, 10 years old, face always smudged with chalk or dirt, hoodie 2 sizes too big. Looked up at Tyler and didn't say anything, just handed him a folded paper. Tyler opened it. Inside was a drawing, messy, full of color. 2 stick figures stood beside a courthouse. One wore a cape, the other held a gavel. Of them, written in lopsided letters, were the words, "Tyler is my HER." Tyler blinked. His fingers tightened around the paper. Malik said, very quietly, "I told Ms. Rena you helped me with my school thing. She said you're smart. Should keep doing lawyer stuff." Tyler couldn't answer. His throat was too tight. Malik shrugged like it didn't matter and walked away. That evening, Tyler sat on the floor and stared at the drawing until the sun went down. Something inside him cracked, not a breaking, more like the slow opening of a window after a storm. He remembered Elijah's case. He, the boy who had protected his sister, the boy Tyler had seen in himself. He had found a precedent for that case, one that could have changed everything. And now, that research was sitting somewhere unused, collecting dust. While Elijah sat in a holding cell waiting to be processed, Tyler opened his laptop for the first time in days. He pulled up the file and began writing. Not a legal brief, not a formal memo, just a letter. It was raw, emotional, honest. He explained how he found the case law, how it applied. He acknowledged he didn't have the right to argue it himself, but begged them not to let Elijah fall through the cracks. He wrote about what it felt like to be young and invisible, to be punished for protecting someone you loved. He didn't write like a lawyer, he wrote like a human being. When he finished, he emailed it anonymously to the public defender's office. No name, no signature. Just the words, "if this helps him." He slept better that night than he had in weeks. In the days that followed, he didn't return to the law center, but he did begin to rebuild his daily rhythm. He helped kids at the group home with homework, fixed a broken desk in the common room, quietly replaced the missing light bulb in the hallway. He started reading again, not to impress anyone, but because he missed the feeling of growing. One day Ms. Rena, the social worker, caught him in the hallway. "You've been different lately," she said, and in a good way. He didn't know why, but those words mattered more than any praise he'd heard from a lawyer. Later that week, while volunteering at the local youth center, he overheard a staff member talking about a girl who was denied a scholarship because of a clerical error. Tyler asked questions, listened, took notes. At night, he researched appeal processes. The next day, he helped draft a letter that reopened the case. 2 weeks later, the girl got her scholarship. Tyler didn't take credit. He never even told her who helped. But he walked home that evening with a steady feeling in his chest. Not pride, not glory, something better. He was becoming the person he wished had existed for him. Not a savior, just someone who sees you when no one else does it. It had been nearly a month since Tyler walked away from the law center. No calls came, no emails. Not that he expected them. In their world, people like him vanished without notice, shadows in the margins. But one afternoon, as he sat on the group home's back steps, watching Malik draw chalk superheroes on the sidewalk, a familiar voice called out from the front gate. It was Jonah, dressed in a plain gray hoodie instead of his usual pressed suit. His posture slightly unsure, eyes scanning until they met Tyler's. He didn't step forward, just waited. Tyler stood up slowly. His chest was tight with old instincts to flee, to brace for disappointment, to expect nothing. But he walked over. Jonah spoke first. His voice wasn't commanding now. It was quiet, almost uncertain. "There's something I need to tell you." Tyler nodded once cautiously. Jonah looked at the ground. "Remember that juvenile assault case, Elijah?" Tyler's breath caught. "We submitted your notes." "I didn't tell Marcia they were yours. Not at first. Just said a legal aid found them in the archive. The judge cited 3 of your arguments in the dismissal." He paused. "Elijah's free. Case dropped last week." Tyler's lips parted, but no words came. And then Jonah reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper. He held it out. It was a letter from Elijah's older sister, handwritten, ink slightly smudged. She'd written about how no one had ever defended her brother like that, how she didn't know who had helped, but that whoever they were, they saved her family. Tyler stared at the words. They blurred as his vision clouded. Jonah cleared his throat, uncomfortable. Didn't handle things right, he said. I let you carry weight you weren't supposed to. And when things got messy, I didn't stand up for you. He looked Tyler in the eyes. That was cowardly. And I'm sorry, Tyler hadn't expected this. Not the letter, not the apology, not the quiet way. Jonah's voice broke when he said it. Jonah continued. Marcia wants to talk, so does the board. They read your original memo, they know it was you now, and they want to offer you something. Tyler didn't answer. His throat was too tight. A moment passed between them. Not forgiveness, not yet. But something gentler than anger. Jonah spoke again, more softly now. You belong in this work, but someday. Now then he turned, walked back to his car, and left. Tyler stood there for a long time, holding the letter in both hands like it might disappear. That night he went up to the roof and sat alone beneath a sky heavy with stars, not looking for signs, not hoping for miracles. Just breathing. The pain was still there, so was the doubt, but something else had grown around it. A stillness. A belief, not in systems, not in people, but in himself, not the performance, not the disguise. The person beneath it all. Tyler had finally come to see what his mother must have seen all along, that he didn't need permission to matter, that his voice wasn't something to earn, it was something to use. And slowly, the walls inside him began to fall, not in triumph. In quiet truth, he wasn't healed, but he was whole. 6 months later, the courtroom looked different, not because of the architecture. The walls were still the same beige stone, the chairs still creaked, and the air still smelled faintly of paper and coffee. But Tyler had changed. He wasn't there as a defendant, not as a hidden intern, not even as a clever imposter in borrowed clothes. He was there by invitation after Jonah's visit. Tyler didn't return to the law center, not at first. He chose something smaller, something that made sense to his soul, working with a nonprofit that helped teenagers navigate juvenile court. Kids like Elijah, kids like him. The job didn't come with prestige or pay or headlines, but it gave him something better, purpose. Ms. Rena had cried the day he left the group home. She packed him a paper lunch like a proud mother and made him promise to keep his receipts. Malik gave him a drawing, another courthouse, another hero with a cape. Tyler looked taller. Today he was here to speak, not as a witness, but as an advocate. The court had asked for community voices in support of reforming the juvenile system. Someone suggested Tyler, then 5 others backed it, then 10. When he stepped up to the podium, his hands didn't shake. He spoke softly, clearly, with the calmness of someone who had nothing left to prove. He told them about a boy who had once stood in a courtroom and been laughed at, about how justice wasn't just about laws, but about being seen, heard, believed. He never said his own name, never told them it was him, but he saw a few eyes in the room soften, and when he stepped down, one judge, an older woman with tired eyes and a gentle nod, stood just a little straighter. Later that week, an op-ed appeared in the local paper. It didn't name him, just describe a young man with insight and heart, someone reshaping how the city thought about second chances. Tyler clipped it and tucked it into a worn notebook beside his mother's old photo. He still visited her grave every month, still talked to her, still told her what cases he was working on, what victories felt like, and which failures still kept him up at night. One morning, he sat by her stone and whispered, I'm doing it, Ma. Not the way they expected, but the way you would have wanted. There were no crowds to hear him, no applause, no medals. But his words felt like home. As summer turned to fall, Tyler returned to school part-time. Not for the degree, for the knowledge. He helped teach workshops at the community center. He stayed in touch with Elijah's family, sometimes joining their Sunday dinners. He laughed more now. He rested. He let himself be young, but most of all, he never forgot the courtroom where it all began, where he'd been humiliated, misunderstood, nearly broken. He returned once, years later, as a licensed advocate. He sat in the back, watched a nervous teenager step up to the bench, and when that kid faltered, unsure, alone, Tyler stood, spoke calmly, offered guidance, and made sure the world didn't miss the brilliance buried inside that trembling voice. He never needed to be the hero in the headlines.